But I'm Scott Marble, chair of the School of Architecture here, and I'm very excited about today. The seed for this lecture probably started before this, but for me it started about a year ago when Zena was here as a juror for the 2018 Portman Prize studio. And it was really clear that she made an intense impression on a lot of students. And so I took note of that and said, okay, this is somebody that I want to bring back to the school as soon as possible. So about a month later, this is now in the summer, probably June of 2018, Julie and I get an email from a student introducing her, very professional, very nice email from a student introducing herself as the new president of NOMAS, Chelsea Davis. So she wanted to meet and tell us what NOMAS wanted to do. So we met over the summer and laid out this incredibly ambitious set of goals and agendas that they wanted to lay out for the next year, which is this year. And as part of those goals, they wanted to to work with the school to bring people to lecture as part of our lecture series. So, so then following that meeting, they sent us a list of people that they wanted to bring. On the top of that list was Zena Howard. So I thought, okay, this is perfect. So this is a collaborative lecture hosting between the school and NOMAS. I'd like to say a couple of words about NOMAS, and then I'm going to introduce Chelsea, and then Chelsea's going to come up and introduce Zena. So first about NOMAS. So I go around to firms around the city often just presenting what's going on at the school, all the events that are going on and all the things that are, the good things that are going on at the school. And one of the things that I always am able to focus on when I give these talks are what's going on with our student organizations. And NOMAS has been so active and so much part of the school since I've been here. And it's always great to be able to tell alumni and people in firms what our student organizations bring to the school. And they bring a dimension to the school that otherwise we just simply wouldn't have. So NOMAS has really been, since I've been here, has been part of the kind of collective effort to elevate the ambition of the school and to do what we can to kind of enhance the sort of educational experience of all of our students. So it's been really, really great. Now, each year, there are a group of members of NOMAS that participate in a competition, and then they participate in a national conference in different cities around the country. And they always do quite well in this competition. In fact, I think the year before Julie and I got here, they won the competition. I think this was 2014. And at the same year, were named the chapter of the year. Since we've been here, I think they've won again and placed again. So the last 2 of the 3 years, they've either placed or won that competition. So, and this has been great because they've brought national recognition to the school. So I'm just going to go ahead and say right now that I think we have the most awesome chapter of NOMAS in the country. I was hoping you guys would like that. So equally important, though, is what they do here. The events that they organize around campus. And just as an example of that, just a couple of nights ago, NOMAS organized an event over in the Hinman building where they honored Bill Stanley and Ivanhoe Love Stanley as the first black graduates of Georgia Tech School of Architecture, and also just acknowledged and honored them for their role as mentors and just as role models for so many students over the years. And then it turned into this conversation, which almost turned into like a comedy show with Bill and Ivan, I've never seen him, do that, but it was quite funny, it was quite entertaining. But it was also just like a really, really insightful advice and information that they were conveying to the students. And so it was a very, very nice event that they had. So I'm very proud of NOMAS, and I think I'm just so excited that they're so active, and I'm so proud of what they bring to the school. But this really doesn't happen without leadership. I mean, an organization is just an organization without leadership, and this is where Chelsea comes in. So Chelsea is the current president of NOMAS. She's a second-year Master of Architecture student. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Architectural Engineering from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. She's also one of our graduate student ambassadors. And as I mentioned, she and others have really kind of done wonderful things this past school year with NOMAS. So please join me in welcoming Chelsea, who will introduce Zena.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. And I also just want to say thank you to the School of Architecture for allowing us this opportunity. Hopefully we can continue it in the future. So this past year, as mentioned, our chapter of NOMAS was able to attend the National Conference in Chicago, where the newly elected president of NOMA National, President Kimberly Dowdle, revealed her platform, encouraging members to be all in for NOMA. Through access, leadership, and legacy, GT NOMAS has worked to adopt the same strategy into our activity on campus by providing the framework for students to access new opportunities and grow their abilities and leadership, all to leave a legacy that will help encourage the continued success of students to come. This lecture is a special event in that we as students are exercising our ability to facilitate and provoke conversations that can have a great impact on us as designers and individuals. This lecture becomes even more important because of the woman who is here with us today to share her work. She has been a trailblazer in the architecture community, not only for minorities, but the entire profession as a whole. She is a woman of virtue and has been a personal inspiration and mentor to me ever since I decided to enter architecture. Zena Howard, Principal and Managing Director of the North Carolina practice of Perkins+Will, is known for her success leading visionary, complex, and culturally significant projects, including the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., several libraries in the Durham County and Durham, North Carolina, the Anacostia and Tinley Friendship Neighborhood Libraries in Washington, D.C., the Motown Museum expansion in Detroit, Michigan, and the new Brooklyn Village Development Initiative in Charlotte, North Carolina. She is an advocate for diversity within the architecture profession, a field where minority and women professionals are historically underrepresented. She is a founding member of Perkins+Will's Diversity Inclusion Council and is an associate professor of architecture at North Carolina State University's College of Design. As a key leader of the cultural practice, today she will share how she has used the power of design to engage disenfranchised communities, unite disparate parties, and infuse cultural meaning into projects from national icons to urban landscapes. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Zena Howard.
Okay, I think I'm live. I am. Thank you, Chelsea. I want to comment that to me, mentorship goes both ways. It goes up and down. And Chelsea, who I met a little over 3 years ago, has also been an inspiration and a mentor in many ways to me. And she helps keep me connected to this school. And I do agree that this NOMAS chapter is the bomb. So continue doing what you're doing. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this and participate. I would not have missed it for anything. It's wonderful to be here. I'm honored to talk to you guys today a little bit about culture and architecture. So Perkins+Will has a robust cultural practice which can be described as certain building typologies, museums, libraries, but also a sensibility and an approach to all design. So we're broad in the spectrum, and I'm happy to be a leader in our cultural practice in North Carolina, where we, as the former Freelon group, under my mentor, everybody has a great mentor, Phil Freelon founded the Freelon group several years ago. We joined Perkins+Will about 5 years ago, and it's been an amazing experience, wonderful to have the platforms that we have to imbue culture. Last thing I'll say before I get started is that it's also great to be talking to you guys in Black History Month. It's really, really powerful. This is always a busy month for me for obvious reasons, but it's wonderful to happen to slide in the last day of Black History Month. So I have a little bit of focus on that for you too. So culture and architecture is an expression of, let me get hot here, okay. We think about culture in every single practice area. It's not limited to one or the other. And several years ago, when we were thinking about what exactly is our attitude about culture, it's really based in this notion that many of our most important environments have been cultural facilities and destinations and things that view us together. I personally define culture as really a story, telling stories, and drawing and telling stories. I've been basically doing the same thing I did since I was 5 years old. It's just that, 50 something, I get paid for it, so that's even better. But understanding that everything has a history and a context, and if you mine for that, you can tell stories through architecture, and the result of that is that it binds people together and allows shared experience culturally. So a few years ago, we created 9 tenets of our cultural practice. And so I'm going to run through these 9 slides very quickly, but they're very, very important if you think about that. The built environment should always strive to do all of these things. Strengthening connections between people, that's the backdrop there is Emancipation Park groundbreaking that we had for a year and a half ago. Collecting, sharing, and preserving history. Building community awareness. That's backdrop is the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Fostering memorable experiences. Embracing cultural identity. Creating transformative experiences, that's the Atlanta Beltline project Perkins+Will did a number of years ago. Celebrating memory. Honoring unique assets. Actually, this image here is from our National Center for Civil and Human Rights. I'll talk about that project in a minute, but this interior photograph is key because this is the MLK gallery, and it has the MLK papers, and it's the only place where those papers are found. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture does not have these papers. So unique assets are really, really key and important. And finally, this thirst for knowledge, always nurturing that thirst, and finding opportunities for knowledge creation. So how does this actually happen? Well, I've been involved in buildings that are, iconic catalyst in their own right, and we think about the word catalyst. This is buildings that catalyze, lots of things. Surely, other, responsible environments, built environments that we love, but also they can catalyze action. Inspire people, bring people around. These are just images over the past 2 years. Anything from the National Women's March to the National March for Gun Violence. And when we think about how spaces and places, the buildings themselves, the cultural landscapes, those in-between spaces that they spark and create, we think about how important it is, siting, context, building, all those things come together to tell the story. They all contribute to that. So how do you start? It's one thing to sort of sit in isolation and think about, shapes, forms, and the like that we as architects love. But it's another thing to take a position that we as architects should be guided by something beyond our own sort of, ethos and egos sometimes. So community engagement and discovery is a huge part of cultural practice for us. For me, it's sort of in the DNA. Most of the ideas, they come from the community. They come from our engagement. So it's not a checkbox. It's actually a relationship. And just about every community that I've engaged with has generated lifelong relationships. So they just don't go away. And having being partnered with community and stakeholders, particularly on some of these large civic initiatives, is really, really important, because when you come back years later, oftentimes they have sustained these facilities. And when I say sustain, it's that they're using it in ways that you thought, wow, didn't anticipate it. It's just such a rewarding feeling. So that's very important. So I'm going to talk about a few projects, some built, some on the boards, some that are in the landscape and beyond, that are really, really important. Of course, most everybody now know that we're more than a couple years out at this point from opening the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington on our mall. So what was really critical about this project is the way that we thought about it. This project is a collaboration of 4 architecture firms. Yes, believe it or not. I don't suggest that number, but it was a collaboration of 4 architecture firms. But the beauty that we all brought our key strengths. So we were the Freelon Group at the time, the lead architecture firm. Actually, our team was called FABS. We say it's short for fabulous, but really it was Freelon, and then David Ajay, and his firm is the A as lead designer. Bond, many of you, particularly from NOMAS, knew Max Bond, Davis Brody Bond. He was originally in our team, and unfortunately Max died just shortly after we won the international design competition. And then there was a Smith group. So curious enough, this project actually, as I said, was an international design competition. We started competing for this in January of 2009, 10 years ago, actually almost 10 years ago to the day. And really, when we met in Washington, D.C., it was the Tuesday after the Saturday that President Barack Obama had his first inauguration. So we were meeting in there the Tuesday after Saturday. Some of these images were images that were taken just that few days before. You can see here the image on the mall. So we decided to have this charrette to sort of explore what a national icon on this site could be. And during that charrette, these were the images that came forward. So we were intrigued by what you see, some of the notions here of what people do when they celebrate. This notion of hope and uplifting and hand-raising. You can see it through the ages in time, and even as relevant as just a couple days before. What was also intriguing to us was agrarian concepts of that are in the South parts of North America and certainly African American. There are things that really resonate with African Americans, and there's this notion of the porch and how many of us particularly have fond memories of how that space really served as an extension of the indoor living space and as a space that really welcomed community. It was just a welcoming gesture, and we did everything on the porch as African Americans growing up in the South. And also this notion of light and modulating light during the spaces. Earlier today I was at Herman Howard's review and saw some intriguing proposals from that studio on a couple of them on thinking about light and how that enters the space. And finally, here that you see this large figure on the right side of your screen is what's called a Caryatid. It's a West African form that's used in art and architecture. It has your classic base, middle, and crown, but this crowning feature or corona was very intriguing to us. So, and that was sort of, so we thought about this sort of melding of West African, Southern American sensibilities and how that all can come together, seeing that this identity of people have roots in, you know, as most of us, because we're all immigrants here, but have roots in both continents. So coming out of that, we looked at, okay, that sort of gave us some clues to form, but what about texture? How would this thing express? For that, we looked in areas of the South, places like New Orleans, Charleston, Savannah, Georgia, southern parts of the United States, where we wanted to tell another story that was not known by many, and many people don't know that a lot of the ironwork that you see in those areas was done by African-American craftsmen and enslaved and freed craftsmen over time. So we wanted to pull that story forward, that beautiful work has its roots in African-American tradition, as well as, you know, the practical aspect of what these things do when they create shade and space in this, you know, light, filigree manner. So we looked at, for the facade, how you sort of interpret that or extract that into a way that's relevant and not mimicry or duplicating something that should be sacred to its time. And the result on the inside of the building is really this sort of a corona-like form that envelops you and modulates light. There's literally 6 different panels of varying porosity that we use to privilege views in and out of the building, because this project was key given its location that you're able to see out. We took a very different approach on this museum, and we actually brought more light in, and even when you're in sort of the interpretive environment, the exhibit experience, where you're sort of immersed and looking at the content, there are moments where we bring you out of that to remind you of your place on the mall. So the result is a building that you know, is different from what you see on the mall. You see a lot of you know, marble and limestone and red clay tile roofs. This building is different in color. We wanted a building that in color reflected the tonality and the different tones that you see amongst African Americans. There's a lot of diversity in color in that race. And so for the south side of the building, again, I told you about how we all have an affinity to porch, the porch and what happens and everything we did. Myself as a child, I did absolutely everything on the porch, from playing jacks. I know a lot of you don't know what that is, but there was this ball that you used to throw up and pick up jacks, but long story, it has nothing to do with an iPad now. But you know, there were just a lot of things. Eating was a culture that was done on the porch. So we took an approach that said, this is the south side of the building. It's very hot. Any of you that have been in Washington, D.C. in July, for the 4th of July, there's no respite from the sun there. So what we thought to do was think about the south side as a bit of a microclimate. We use water in many ways in this building. The story of water is very critical to the way many African Americans got over to North Carolina. It relates to the Middle Passage. Not North Carolina, to America. It relates to the Middle Passage. So we used a combination of running and still water, and even on the inside of the water, in the building, we used water. But we placed water in this overhang of the museum, and used water on the inside in a cleansing manner, vertically, and ultimately in the end, you see on the south side this beautiful expression of sort of a contemporary expression of a porch. That's our interpretation of it. It's a clear 180 span, really deep, you know, knife edge coming at you, this gesture that's 60 feet deep that you know, sort of is exaggerated version of how we feel about that welcoming element, and really putting that in contrast against the lightness of the facade. So that's one example of telling a very, very large story that represents multiple people you know, named and unnamed, an entire identity of people. But what about these smaller stories? So I'm going to go and show you an example of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro. This building itself is iconic. This is the building where in 1960, on February 1st, 4 African-American students, all male, from North Carolina A&T University, made a bold decision. They decided to walk into the F.W. Woolworth store and sit down at a lunch counter and demand to be served. So that gesture alone of these 4 students sparked a movement that we know across the country as the sit-in movement that was a precursor to the national movement of civil rights in this country and the fight for civil rights. What was important about this building, it wasn't just, you know, when the owner approached us, they said, we have this building and we want to put an exhibit inside the building that honored the building. And we said, fair enough, but this building needs to be so much more. Restoring, you know, the elements back to its original gesture, including the original lunch counter. Part of that was already taken away and sat at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. So we had to replicate the part that Smithsonian had, but the rest was all the original lunch counter and Art Deco stairs, restoring that. But the most important thing about this project, beyond just historic preservation and bringing back the storytelling, was the ability to capture the oral histories of what happened during that time, what made for, you know, 18, 19, 20-year-olds decide to do something like that. What was the conversations like that led to that? So a lot of effort went in figuring out how to tell that story. And that's important because this is a photograph when we opened the museum where all 4 men were still alive, and today they're not. You know, all 4 are not all still alive. So to be able to realize that and capture that oral history, which is so important to African Americans, again, telling stories and writing or drawing, because African Americans were not allowed to read or write. So that expression of oral history and also drawing and art is very, very important to the culture of people. I'm going to move on to closer to my home, North Carolina, in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's the Harvey B. Gantt Center. Really, really important. Anybody, you know, we're very close to Charlotte, so a lot of you have been there, know that a lot has gone on in that city in terms of development. But if you look at this little sliver of land, our client, we had been working with them to find a site for this center for quite some time. And so then they explained to us that the city had given them this real sliver of a site here. And they were a little bit, you know, incensed by it. Like it's like 50 feet wide by over nearly 600 feet long. So the proportions were not ideal. And beyond that, it was actually the site, the truck access ramp to access the new Bank of America's Wachovia then, now it's Bank of America Tower, that was being built at the time. So anyway, it really is a sliver of a site. So, but we said sort of pause because it was in a great location. It was at the heart of all of the cultural amenities that were going up, the new Beckler Museum by Mariel Bodo, the Mint Museum, it was the NASCAR museum's not far away, the convention center. So, you know, location, 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 and sometimes you have to just say, can we make this work? We believe that we could. So our approach was, again, going back. Research is a huge part of this, looking at the history. We knew that this was really in close proximity to the adjacent Brooklyn Village neighborhood that was destroyed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that was destroyed in the 60s under urban renewal. And so this was a vibrant, wonderful, thriving African-American neighborhood, the only one on that east-western part of the state. But of most important was a school there, and it's the Myers Passage School. But what was critical about that school is that they had this edifice called Jacob's Ladder, and this was a traditional way in which every year graduation was held, and students graduated from that school. They positioned themselves and took this annual classic photo on Jacob's Ladder. So we were intrigued by remembering, that school, and also notions of quilting and fabrics and what that meant, and how that was used for dialogue and conversation, and quite honestly, communications of freedom and how one obtains freedom. So we looked at those notions of Jacob's Ladder combined with weaving, combined with using Jacob's Ladder to elevate the building up above. Remember I told you that truck access ramp, still had to deal with that. But in the end, the building sort of comes together as a expression, our interpretation of how this weaving and this movement of Jacob's Ladder comes through the site, all around the building, even on the side of the building where there is a zero lot line, where in the future somebody can build right up next. We took great care in expressing the building. And then this is one of my favorite photographs, because this is actually taken from the highway that destroyed the Brooklyn Village neighborhood. So you can sort of see how it sits nestled there amongst the highways, and you see that from the highway. So that was the Gantt Center, which was really an important project for us. But then around the same time when we were doing the National Museum for African American History and Culture in DC, there was also the National Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta. So most of you, I assume, know this building. Of course you should, and know its location on the Coca-Cola Center. So this was quite interesting. We were intrigued by what we called a space for action, because this was telling another story. We talked about telling the broad story of a people versus a story of four men who made a bold decision versus a cultural center that takes a more regional approach to tell a story about what happened there in Charlotte. This one is talking about civil rights and human rights all over the world, not necessarily focused on any one identity. What intrigued us was spaces for action and the ability of people, when they're really struggling for human rights, to come together, and how they do that, how they come together in solidarity, the diversity of people, locking arms, embracing each other. So this notion of two curving walls and creating a space for action was really, really important to us. So the building, as you know, is sited on the Coca-Cola Plaza. It's really two curving walls of various sizes, colors, shapes of panels that represents the diversity of people across the world, embracing the content, working with Larry Kirkland to do an art piece there that also expresses the aspiration in steel, glass, and water. Quite honestly, bringing that water element back in, seeing the sort of glassy, open content interior of the museum that spills out onto the Coca-Cola Center. And this really gives you a real close-up of looking at those panels and that diversity, and how we really thought about that. And then finally, the final result of these walls curving around and being able to circulate around those. So this is kind of the last built project. This is on the Boers. This is the Motown Museum in Detroit, Michigan. And I think they made me select songs when you guys were coming in. So you probably heard a couple of Motown songs that were playing as you were getting seated. But if you think about Motown, now this is another story that's national, because Motown really is, in many ways, the music that changed America. Music was pretty much segregated in America before Motown. So how did this happen that that this music can come to life and still today impact so much of what you hear? So you young people, because you're much younger than I am, what you're hearing today, a lot of that was influenced by people that have come before you, including Motown. So it's just a variation on a theme, right? So in looking at how you tell this story, again, another major story that can be told through many different lenses. It can be told through the lens of the artist, the producers, Berry Gordy himself, so many different ways to tell the story. But there was something that we knew that was very, very important, that in order for Motown to be what it was, 4 things had to happen. There were 4 ingredients, and without any one of those 4 ingredients, Motown would actually not have happened. So the first is Berry Gordy, who anybody that knows his history, the Gordy family was very disciplined, and he came up in that rigor of focus and discipline and self-drive and motivation. So that created Berry Gordy, the man himself, right? So when Berry Gordy, like many, many African-American families, migrated from the South to the North as part of the first migration to escape, obviously, really a lot of situations, negative situations in the South, and Detroit is where they landed. And so Berry Gordy was working on one of the big 3 motor companies and on the assembly line, and really just sort of achieved his vision by daily working on those assembly lines and really just thinking about beats in his head and really believing that I can create music. I believe I can do this. Of course, we know the story, got a $700 loan from his sister and moved on. And then what did he do next? He bought a little house called Hitsville, right there on West Grand Boulevard. And he purchased this house because it was the only house in the area that had a detached garage, which he called Studio A. He bought the house, and then he drove around the streets of Detroit and other places and plucked people off the streets, because back then, African Americans made music on the street. Like my dad, did the 2-step on the street corner, and so it was just what they did back then. I know we can't relate to it. We don't. But that's what they did. Everybody sung on the street corner. So he plucked little Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson. All of these people, they were teenagers. They were 17. They were kids just singing on the street corner. Put them in Studio A and began making music. And the most important thing to remember about that is that the Motown sound is a result of the physical architecture of Studio A and the Hitsville house. So what Berry Gordy did was recorded in that detached garage from Studio A, but he really just piped that sound up into the A-frame of Hitsville here, and they recorded off of that reverberated sound, and that's why you get that everybody knows when you hear a Motown sound, because you get that cadence and that from that reverberation. And all of the major studios could not replicate the Motown sound. They tried with all of their fancy studios and equipment, and it was a result of architecture. So stay in architecture, right? The 4th ingredient was the city of Detroit itself. As I mentioned, it was one of the cities as part of the first migration out of the South, major migrations that provided opportunity, largely in the auto manufacturing. So in thinking about how we tell this story, I gave myself away too, because one of the songs that was playing when you guys came in was a song that we thought represented in many, many ways the spirit of Motown. It's very rare that we might pick one sort of angle to work this in, but it works for Motown, it works for this project. We looked at, in terms of form, we looked at all of the top 100 hits of Motown and how they sort of stack on albums to CDs to these days. You don't stack anything, but imagine how the record albums used to stack. Color mapping those major colors that were all classic Motown colors, just about in every album cover that you saw. And really the song What's Going On by Marvin Gaye was really something that is timeless. I mean, if you play and hear that song today, it resonates in so many ways with today. It's just as relevant today as it was decades ago when it was written. So thinking about that and that song and really taking the major refrain from what's going on and sound mapping that and putting really sort of a subbeat behind the album covers, and so really giving the building a song to sort of sing. And so that's the approach to Motown, again telling the story in a different way, but in a way that we feel is really, really relevant. So moving beyond sort of iconic buildings and building types and working within that individual context, we thought a lot, started thinking about 3 years ago about sense of place and how place is created and how culture works so well to create these shared experiences, to remind us all of our humanity and to bind us across our differences, that we thought about how this can be used in the broader context in urban landscapes and beyond the four walls. So I'm going to share with you a couple examples of how we thought about the broader context. Again, in North Carolina, in Greenville, this is the closest project to me. I love it. It's just 1 hour up the street. And we were contacted, it was like a Christmas, like a couple days before Christmas, and asked to come look at this because the city was struggling with how to commemorate something, a wound in this community that had been there for years. This is, the city is redeveloped. This is a historic photo of what Greenville looked like in the mid-60s. And the project was being developed, but there was one area, 1.1 acre, where there used to be a historic church called Sycamore Hill Baptist Church. And this church and its community, you can see it there, it was small, but it was important because everyone that sort of went to, that lived in that community went to church. It was back in the days when you had to go to church. That wasn't an option. And most of the people that came through that community, went through that church, went on to be just really wonderful contributing citizens in their own communities and accomplished in their own rights. So what happened to this community? Why isn't it still here today? Essentially, it was something called urban renewal. Basically, the city came in and just wiped out the entire community. Obviously, a lot of this stuff happened in the 60s, so these people are still alive today. And there's a lot of memory that they have that's attached to this place. The community was able to save the church, and actually you could see the road kind of being rerouted or in place around the church. But it then fell to, later on, to presumably arson. And so the whole of it was lost. We just had this little 1 acre. So we went, 1 acre to do something with, and it was really causing quite a brouhaha in that area to actually put something there, and previous design efforts to resolve this just were not successful. So the city was sort of at the end of their road. We came in and took a look, but we went back through like we normally do and just went back and engaged with that community. And what came out of that was themes that really resonated with them. There were things that they told us and stories that they told, and the people that were there about community, spirituality. People talked about the people that went to that church and people that didn't. We talked with people that used to just pass by that church on Sundays and talk about the music that emanated from there. History, prominence, all of these themes came out. And so we thought it was important to think about music and the randomness of music, but also think about they were really there are 22 founders, people that founded this church, and how important that was to them and how they spoke about the 22 founders. And also we knew we were pretty much in the exact location of the original church. And so there were key elements, many of the elements that had stained glass only in certain areas. And there were just key moments within this church that were very, very important within the historical architecture. So thinking about, well, okay, what people did in those spaces and the memories that they had of gathering, welcoming, rejoicing, the choir, reflection, prominence. And so our interpretation was looking at how we sort of meld all those things of the 22 founders, the music, the memories, the space making. And so we created, sort of a memorial that recognizes all of those elements coming together, that's joined with interpretation. So working to tell stories of the historical stories and the forward-looking stories, recalling certain key elements and using the memory of stained glass in very, very strategic ways. The pattern of the stained glass is actually the original grid of the plan from the community. If you look at the old land use maps, this is somebody's lot right here, So we just kind of brought all that back in subtle ways and restored these things that they felt emotionally, like prominence, and restoring the walk back down. They used to do baptisms towards the river, places of worship, the feeling of the old sanctuary without necessarily replicating it, and then bringing in and remembering and recalling what was there. In Vancouver, similar sort of story here, area called Hogan's Alley. And if anybody knows, Hogan's Alley is actually a term that was, I thought, I didn't even know this, it's similar to sort of Skid Row. It's actually a term that is actually meant to mean slum or blighted areas. And so this was real intriguing. We're doing a massive, proud to say, Perkins+Will has been in lockstep with the city for years, doing a massive redevelopment of the entire area around the bay there, the Northeast Falls Creek. So Vancouver has made the bold decision to take down their viaducts, the highways that they put up, and bring them to grade. Now they do say in Vancouver, they say, unlike North America, they actually, when they built their cities in the 60s, they did not run them straight through and chop up their cities. They did run them on the edge of the city and kept the city intact, if anybody's been to Vancouver, except for one little area, this little 5-acre area that's our study area. They took an off-ramp right through that area and destroyed the only multicultural place in the entire city and the only home for African Americans, which was a very, very small number, in the hundreds at that time. So displaced, had no home. This was traditionally a porter's town. We again went through the research, thinking about how, what was there in Hogan's Alley, how people lived. Really looking at the level of growth there. There was organic growth, but there were fond memories, but there were fond memories of these alleyways and what Hogan's Alley was. And then there was actually, wonderful, businesses. So it was this mix of what was there back then. And really when you engaging with this community, talked about the loss of potential. If they had been allowed to stay there, 5 decades later, where would they be? What would they, if the land rights had remained intact and they could have paved their own future? There were a lot of memories about these power poles that ran rampant down these alleys. Everybody talked about, and bought pictures of this, so that was pretty prominent. We looked at the prevailing design themes that came out of engaging with this community, things such as creating a cultural center, organic geometry. If you've been in Vancouver, you know that there's glass towers, basically almost like beautiful, beautiful city, by the way. But it is got its very distinct aesthetic, and so they wanted something that really represented something more of who they were. An exterior that responded to its urban environment, but an interior that was more reflective of their culture. Passages and storytelling was a big, big theme. I'll talk about that in a minute. And spaces for social connection was also very, very important. So the concept narrative was all about, I won't read this, but it was really all about porches in between spaces, just really a beautiful memory. This is actually a childhood photograph of one of the people that we were part of our advisory committee that we engaged with throughout this project. That's a childhood photograph on the porch. So what we conceived of was bringing back the original 25-foot lot kind of dimension, that scale that everybody could relate to, pushing and pulling a bit, restoring Hogan's Alley. That's in the original alignment where it actually was, in a way that brings back that memory, anchoring the site with a cultural center that responds to this. There's a wonderful Asian community here to the north. Thinking about all the themes that come in, vibrant color, art, dance, all the things that really reflect this community, sort of more of an organic culture, bringing back opportunities for food, getting rid of, in many of these areas, some of the food deserts, and bringing in craft and small businesses and those things that can really have the opportunity to thrive and create economic growth. So this is sort of how we envision Hogan's Alley working, some gesture of a community center, bringing back the iconic Porter's train there, looking at how we can actually, the residential areas above, how they could be connected above the street level with structures that recall those power poles, remember, that everybody talked about, but it just some way kind of acknowledges and brings back that feeling. You're just bringing back that connectedness and that feeling, and this notion of everything spilling out, the craft, the improvisation, everything spilling out onto the street corner and not necessarily behind glass storefront was really important for them in this area. This is the same view from the other end where you see art. Public art is huge, and often these projects are huge collaborations and unusual collaborations with artists, historians, anthropologists. It's no longer just the architects, in our own little world, being able to create these types of places that really serve community and sustain. A little bit away in Charlotte, we have Brooklyn Village. This is a wonderful project where we're beginning to reshape the core of a major city here. Here's some city maps from the late 1800s, and you can see it's Second Ward. So Charlotte kind of goes third, fourth, first, and so we're right here. And that was that community. Remember I showed you the building, the cultural center, that Jacob's Ladder and the weaving. This was the community that we designed that for years earlier, not knowing that we were going to come back years later and actually have this project, but we were trying to remember this community, the Brooklyn Village community, with that design. And so it was a prosperous community. I mean, African Americans owned their own businesses. They owned really beautiful homes, homes that in this area today are, selling for, $800, $1 million. They were just beautiful. There were memories of churches, banks that they owned. The Second Ward High School is huge, and actually the main developer under this project that we're doing, part of what he's doing is actually funding an endowment for the Second Ward High School to program a lot of the spaces that we're designing. So it was really a nice area. But it was destroyed under urban renewal in 1965 or so. And keep in mind, redlining was a precursor to urban renewal. So cut off the funding, the place goes into slum and disrepair, then you have justification for urban renewal. So that was sort of the strategy in a lot of these communities. But even when the structures were wonderful and beautiful and not in disrepair, the fact that they were owned by African Americans justified redlining and hence urban renewal. So the destruction was pretty vast. It was just completely wiped out. And wiped out in a sense that even later there wasn't even a betterment of any sort put there. It just, there was a county building put there and it's just sat underutilized in many ways. So again, going back, looking at the historic local roads, one thing that stood out to us was this Myers Street that sort of connected both communities. This project is in 2 phases. We couldn't, hopefully at some point, the city or this will be up for development, but it's really the 11.5 acre and the 5.5 acre there. Looking at the uses, mapping all of the wonderful uses that used to be there. And so ultimately in the end, we're restoring Myers Passage, a vibrant pedestrian way that connects both ends of the development and an active heart of the city, a public park. This will be fairly large, 2-acre park, which is significant in that area, a public amenity that we view as the heart of the city and pulsing down with the vein of Myers Passage all the way through, putting in interpretation in the landscape, historic maps, things that recall the churches, bringing back the scale. So this is the last project I'm going to talk about, and I think I have time to do that, a little bit of time. This is called Destination Crenshaw, and it's in Los Angeles, and it's really truly a celebration of Black Los Angeles. So really a lot of people, this is a story, a lot of this work is telling stories that have either never been told before or that are misunderstood and have been told correctly. So a lot of what comes out of what in the national narrative about Black South Los Angeles, gangs, drugs, the usual stuff, and no one really recognizes the huge contribution that community has made to the culture of this country and beyond, whether it's the political culture, certain movements, the car culture, the entertainment culture. It goes on and on and on. There's so much that's come out of this area, from Kwanzaa to Black Lives Matter to the Pentecostal movement. It just goes on, and nobody really knows those stories. So this is an outdoor museum, and unlike a lot of work that we do and that I do, it's the result, here we are in 2019, of infrastructure. There's a metro line that's being built from the LAX to get you closer to downtown. But what's happening here is that this is the 1 mile stretch of Destination Crenshaw, which will be this outdoor cultural and entertainment experience. In every single area of this new line, in a major community, particularly the commercial core of a community, the train is either going predominantly undergrade or above grade. The city ran the train at grade in this community, and it saved them, about $800 million doing it. And so this community was obviously, it was another insult. Like, why would you take the African American community and do that yet again? Here we are. Who thinks that happens anymore? That's the stuff that used to happen in the 60s when we all were, fetishizing over our cars, right? But the community decided that they were going to take an approach that takes basically the lemons that they were given and make lemonade. And so they decided to celebrate that this train is at grade and create an experience here. This indicates the 1.3 miles or so from 60th to 48th, with north headed towards 48. by the way, not only was the city going to run the train right through at grade, they weren't even going to stop. So the city fought to have this stop put here so that at least people can get off and there can be an opportunity to invest in this area economically. So they did win that fight, which is great, the Hyde Park station. Lots of engagement with this community. Again, this is a lot to get across in 1.3 miles, and there's really no precedent for it. This will be the first time that someone has taken an iconic city, street name like Crenshaw and used it for a community-inspired initiative like this. So our clients are politicians, they're artists, they're historians, they're everyone. It's a huge, massive collaboration. In engaging with them, there were these really key 4 objectives, obviously celebrating the heritage. There are existing assets there that are amazing that people know about in the area. People understand the wall and other things, so we want to leverage those. Obviously create a unique experience, but also, sort of combat years of disinvestment from this community and find a way to catalyze growth. So that was key. So there's a lot going on with architecture, landscape art, exhibit design. There's a metro. We needed something that was something that we could corral around and that unified us all into one direction to create something that was it's really meaningful and rooted in purpose here. So at the time, I was reading a book by Dr. Mindy Thompson, full of love, called Root Shock, and it really talks about what has happened in many, many urban areas in the United States. Over the past 400 years, there have been a lot of things that have caused displacement, uprooting, the inability to stay and plant and thrive. And some things are less, if we go back 400 years ago to slavery, there's nothing today as overt that happens as slavery, but there are other things that are happening that result, the impact which has the same impact or effect of root shock, or the ability to just be at home, right? And so she describes that as destruction of one's emotional ecosystem. When we looked across the country, really there are very few areas in the country where generations and generations of African Americans have lived. There are some examples. We have a couple. There are certain areas in like south side of Chicago, but Harlem is the best example. And so when we look at Harlem, we see, you can go there and generations of African Americans have lived there. And despite of people, gentrification happening, mass gentrification, they've been able to lead with culture in many, many ways to help combat displacement. So when you go to Harlem, you're there, the Apollo Theater is not going anywhere. It marks that place. And, the Adam Clayton Powell statue is not going anywhere. So you're in a space that is culturally rich, and people come there with the attitude of contributing to the culture, not erasing it or feeling as if they're bringing a better culture there. That's the part of gentrification that we're stopping. So we're really working on this end of the spectrum of what's happening today. The other stuff is, as they say, history to some extent. But those areas, we believe, are important. So understanding migrations, how African Americans even got to the western part of the country in the beginning, understanding the global migration and the diaspora and all the continents that impacted, and also understanding the 2 major migrations out of the South, from South to North and from South to West after the war. Was really, really huge, and that is predominantly where how African Americans ended up in California as a part of the second migration. So looking at the history over the past 50 years, and this is going to be interesting to see when the next census comes out for many, which is 2020, will be happening soon. But you can see over the past 60 or so years, with the dark being majority Black population, how it has changed and really shrunk. And so this area right in here is basically where Crenshaw Boulevard is. So that's the predominance. So in thinking about this, in doing a lot of research and thinking what really represents this story the best, and what metaphorically can we sort of hang our hats on, it was interesting in our research in Nigeria. There is, in many parts of the Gold Coast of Savannah, there was a grass known as, and is known as, the giant star grass, and it's a rhizome, meaning it's really an interconnected, hardy root system. If anybody knows a rhizome, hard to, kill in many ways. But the beauty of this giant star grass is that it was used as bedding hay on slave ships that left the Gold Coast. So it really did trace the diaspora in many ways. So because it was native to Western Africa, it should have died right there. But it didn't. It survived and it thrived. And today we know that grass in this country is Bermuda grass. And it's really found on just about every inhabitable continent. So to us, thinking about how that giant star grass survived and thrived, and it just is kind of a mystery, but it represents the exact story of Black South Los Angeles, where that community, generations have thrived and survived and contributed to a larger narrative, much like a rhizome. So we were inspired by that and this notion of encouraging people to stay and invest in their own communities, which is going to be really, really important for Crenshaw. This notion of growing where you're planted. We decided to tell the story through 4 major lenses. Improvisation, the ability of this community to create. We were talking, earlier about in the studio about how you take, any and everything, things that people throw away, soul food and many things were created from scraps of things that people didn't want. But the ability to improvise and create in spite of and contribute that creativity, a lot of the things that even in our clothing culture that's prominent today was created and here in South Los Angeles, but is appreciated elsewhere. First, there are many, many firsts, some that I talked about earlier, many first stories, first incidents. So we wanted to celebrate that. Dreams, this notion of the ability of this community to continue to dream. And this note is actually at the famous wall that I'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, togetherness, the ability of this community to come together in celebration, in worship, in protest, in whatever. It was just all of this we thought represented the spirit. And so this Destination Crenshaw will include new streetscapes, exhibits, major art installations, the renaissance of Black artists, all of the Black artists, the major artists that you see today, Kehinde Wiley, Mark Bradford, Kerry James Marshall. These were artists that maybe 5 years ago, their pieces may have been selling for maybe $250,000, maybe $500,000. That right now, these pieces are $500 million and above. So I'm like $5 million and above. So this is huge, this renaissance of Black visual artists. We know Kendrick Lamar just won the Pulitzer. So it's performing art, it's visual art, it's the mural art, it's the graffiti art. And it's just amazing to just think about having one place to celebrate that. So metaphorically, we're designing shade canopies, brass inlays that help tell the story, and everything is directionally, in our minds, everything moves from south to north or south to west, because that helps us understand how that migration pattern happened. And so using many of those, using interpretive elements, wayfinding systems, banners that help fuel sort of the connective tissue, that thing that links everything together. There will be pocket parks, parklets along the way. but there's something that's going to tie the experience together. And these interpretive story panels are, we're thinking about how they're custom designed, how we bring in the digital experience into all that. But what we thought about is that this isn't a typical, museum. Yes, the experience is didactic, but we wanted to look at a fresh, really, approach to that. So historical images, historical pictures, we have illustrators that are embedded in our team so that we are able to work with these illustrators so that the imagery is taking on a Black aesthetic. So you do recognize folks, Muhammad Ali and others, but it's really from their lens and making sure that this, first and foremost, remains community inspired. The branding and graphics, again, local illustrators are developing unique patterns that will be unique to Crenshaw, and these are derived from the Black African-American tradition of quilt making. And so you'll see how we use that in some of the branding, and as we create that sense of place along Crenshaw. Environmental equity is important. So in 2012, yes, not so long ago, or I think, no, I'm sorry, 2002, I believe it was, can't remember. When the city moved the Endeavor down the street, they wiped out every single tree, every single one. Yeah, it was in 2012, actually, yeah. Every single tree was removed, and they put not a one back. So, no. So when you go there, it's really quite odd being in a place with no trees. I actually had to take 5 breaths and just say, how is this possible? How is this possible that people, that someone thinks it's okay for people to live this way? So, environmental equity, we are putting back 822 trees. And really the big thing here is that the palette and the infusion of just green space back into this, it will have take on an Afrocentric palette. These trees and this planting are a mixture of plantings that are native also to the area. And so it's wonderful to bring that back. The public art, there are many, many art opportunities. There will be about 10 major artists. So some of these big name artists will have, there's about 10 of those that will have commissions along the way. And then anything from 2D to 3D opportunities all the way down to emerging artists and using, and consistent with the spirit of that community, appropriating just about every surface for art that we can find, and just having it being a wonderful tapestry to show. So just to give you a quick overview, at this first node that I told you about, improvisation, there will be a monument there that marks, upwards of 120 feet tall. That is really, we've thought a lot about the ability of this community to improvise, to take everyday materials and create something special. So to take, steel and bend it in a way that creates something special. So that marker will be seen from an airplane. That's what the intent was, that we wanted, thinking about these shading structures and these parklets and how they, work with some of the art pieces that are envisioned to go there. Again, another parklet, thinking about art, thinking about the connective tissue, the experience all the way down. Moving down to dreams. Looking at the wall that I told you about that has the historic painting mural of Our Mighty Contributions that have evolved over time, looking at that rhizome pattern, how it comes up, how it then expresses itself through shade structures all the way out. Again, the historic asset of Our Mighty Contributions, that mural on the wall. Looking at, this is an artist piece here, and looking at how we create spaces for art. And finally, on the far end is a park that we have called Sankofa Park. And it was really inspired by, this is actually an image that during one of the sessions, a community member held up that we Sankofa, which is an African term that means sort of to go back and get what was taken, and talked about how important that was. So we thought about, symbolically using that Sankofa inspiration to create this park that is a space. We're creating a space where people can come together. You can actually even also drive a lowrider in throughout, it's because they have the parades for lowriders that are wonderful. So looking at how we meld art and architecture and interpretation and landscape design with all of that to really create a space that's community-driven, community-inspired, that's fun, that's hip, and that provides shade. So the shading structures there is really, really important. And finally, that notion of looking back from where you came. Yes, you can look back down Crenshaw Boulevard, but also you get high enough to see the Historic Vision Theater sign and the Hollywood Hills sign in the distance. So it's really about bringing people up and allowing them to take in the full, robust experience of the 1.3 miles that is Destination Crenshaw. And finally, I kind of just leave, whenever I do this presentation, with this quote by Dr. Fuller Loves that talks about staying, investing in your own communities, and sort of leaving a legacy to your next generation. So that is it. And so thank you. I think I'm going to take questions.
All right, so as they're setting up, thank you again, Zena, for that awesome lecture.
Yes.
Hopefully you all received some insightful information from it. We will now open up the floor for a conversation, which will be led by members from GT Nomos. And then afterwards, we will open the floor for questions by the audience.
Sit here. I think I'm so hot, yeah.
So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We were really inspired by your presentation today, and just being around you, honestly, just helps inspire us to make it through midterms.
Of course, yeah.
So I'm Candace Seda, Masters of Architecture student and Vice President of GT Nomos. And my question for you is kind of around these cultural projects in practice. So moving through your career, how were you able to put yourself into positions to be able to work on projects like these? And how do you approach clients, or how do you, find the clients to be able to make meaningful architecture in practice?
Well, that's two very good questions. So I'll start with the latter. Some of these projects, just by the nature of what they are, if somebody comes to you wanting to do an iconic museum on the National Mall, the opportunity is given to you, but if somebody comes to you wanting to do, a medical office building, that may not be. So we look for opportunities. I presented a lot of opportunities in the cultural practice, but there's library typologies that I didn't show you, where we infuse culture into it. So if it's in your DNA, you can, if it's something that you love to do, every project that I've been associated with has provided that opportunity. How you get into doing that? Well, I can only share with you my history. I actually joined the Freelon group 16 years ago, and joined Phil Freelon, who was already had a good cultural practice. I had already doing some libraries and museums, mostly museums. And then when I joined, I was like, gosh, this is really great. We feel like we can take this to the next level and evolve this. And so really getting, when I was considering joining the Freelon group, I was in Pennsylvania, and I was working for a firm where I myself, me alone, was like, in the community, just looking for any opportunity to do cultural. And I actually did do a little exhibit at the base of a of a very large parking structure. And I was like, yes, finding any opportunity to do it. And then when the opportunity came to actually move and work with the Freeline Group, I knew that was territory where I could express myself. So it's really about aligning yourself with the values of an organization. If they're doing that, those opportunities will come. The merger with Perkins+Will has even been even more wonderful because it's just kind of providing yet a even larger platform to begin to do this, and more opportunities and great clients to begin to do this. So it's really about associating yourself with great firms and people that have your like mind and share your values.
Hello, my name is
Hi.
Bang Siakuchu. I'm a first year Masters of Architecture student. And my question is, in a lot of your projects, there's heavy community engagement. So what is your strategy to drawing out the community to come out and participate and give input into the designs that you guys are proposing?
Yes, so the community engagement part, that is, so for me, going back in history, community engagement, it really did used to be kind of that thing you checked off your list and kept rolling, and let's get, years ago, let's get through this and then get to designing what we really want. Yes, we've heard from the community. And then, awakening that community engagement is design. And so for us, it's not about, advertising and having a big community meeting. That's part, and some public processes require that. But with each client, we work with them to identify that group of people that's going to be with us from beginning to end. And that's why I mentioned that these relationships are built, because really when you're working with that small group, it becomes family. So it's got to be people, they're heavily scrutinized. We talk about it with our clients. It's got to be people that are well-rooted, well-grounded, well-connected with their communities, can represent their communities well, and can go back and be ambassadors. Sometimes we call them thought leaders in the community. They can go back and share information and be ambassadors, but it's not a bunch of random people plugging in and out of a process, and I think that's when community engagement kind of goes awry.
Hi, my name is Paula Morales, and I'm a second-year architecture undergrad. What has been the biggest challenge that you have faced so far in designing all of these cultural buildings?
I would say the biggest challenge, these projects, you have to have patience. So, first of all, they have they're long projects. Smithsonian was 10 years total for my firm, and of those 10 years, I was 8 years full time. So often you start with people, like when we started with the Smithsonian, they had no money, they had enough to pay our fee, they had no exhibits, no content. The executive director, Lonnie Bunch, barely had an office. So they're making it as they go along. They're getting staff as you go. They're collecting content. They call you up and announce one day that they have a train they want to put in the building, and we're under construction. Okay, how are you going to get? Okay, they've acquired a train. Okay, let's think about how to get that in the building now. So it is really an organic process. It's not like other typologies where the institutions do this regularly. They're well organized. So I think you have to have people that are sort of used to, going the long haul there. In the end, they're rewarding. You eventually, you get paid. It's great, but they're fundraising as you go along. So it's really, I would say that you have to have, understand a lot of what you're trying to do and strive for those higher values and stay engaged. So I would say that oftentimes those are the challenges.
And so I have one more question before we open it to the crowd. One of the things we were talking about in Monday was representation of minorities within the community of architecture. So what does it mean to you being a licensed Black female architect in the field? And do you know your number?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know my number. I should look that up. I never thought to. No one's ever asked me that. So I'm actually going to look that up. So being a licensed Black architect. So when I came out of architecture school, there were 80 Black female architects in the country. Today, there's just about 400, maybe a little bit more. So much better, but still a great dearth of people. So I didn't have, I certainly didn't have role models that looked like me, and I certainly didn't even have, on the female side, just my physical identity, and I certainly didn't have role models, many that were even of my same race. So that's why I consistently think that it's important to have mentorship. I was talking earlier when Chelsea reached out to me 3 years or so ago, that meant a lot to me because I remember, albeit decades ago, but I remember, trying to find my way in this profession and just feeling like an alien, not really knowing, just, maybe here, just, it was all trial and error. And so I try to make sure that others have a better experience than I did. But I'm very proud of our profession. It's rigorous. It's a small profession compared to many others. I mean, we have like 115,000 architects in the United States versus like 1.5 million lawyers and 1 million doctors. So relatively speaking, we're a small profession with a lot to do because there's not really, in my opinion, there's not enough architects to do all the work that really we have to do. So mentoring and growing architects, particularly when our client base is so diverse, and understanding that people, diversity, they bring women, other underrepresented populations, they bring a sensibility to our practice that is just making it so much better, and really it's enjoyable to come to work every day.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll open it to questions from the audience.
Hi, that was an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
I'm a graduate urban design student here. My question is, most of the projects that you showed are have huge implications on the city as a whole, on a larger scale. So they'll affect the public realm of not just the surroundings, but to a larger extent too. So can you elaborate a little more on what implications would these projects have on the urban framework of the city, like DC, like a Smithsonian Museum, like that, on the whole framework of the city?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Oftentimes, the way these projects happen, they happen with, I know the word collaboration these days gets overused, but they happen with having folks like the city on board. If you don't have these people on board, you got to do the work to get them on board, because that's the way, with this level of support, they're able to have that huge impact. Even the small one, the little one that I showed you, the 1.1 acre for the city of Greenville, that's huge for the city of Greenville. That's the largest amount of money that the city has ever appropriated to do a project of this type. So it's huge for them, and it's only a 1 acre little thing. And so we work oftentimes in lockstep with our clients to help them communicate their vision. But they have that level of impact because it's more people involved than just designers thinking that we can design a beautiful object and give it to somebody and that they're going to love it. It doesn't happen that way. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adriana, and I'm a Master's of Architecture student. My favorite part about your entire presentation was just how one small idea blew up and could represent, or it was reinterpreted into a building. And I'm interested in knowing, how did those small conceptual ideas come about? Is it usually something brought on from research that the architects do, or was it brought on by the community? Like someone, brought up the star grass, and then you guys ran with it. How, could you give me some backstory on how some of those happen?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. The ideas are, we use what we hear from the community, and then the most exciting thing is that then we go back in studio and we talk about what we heard, and we talk about the emotions, and then that's where the magic in my mind happens. That's what I'm kind of addicted to, just, well, what then represents that? So normally it comes from the architects, because we think really hard. We're the ones, we come in with kind of a clean slate, and we hear all of the stories. So you may be passionate about your particular story, and so we have to triangulate and sort of, work through all that we've heard, and then distill what we believe is the most, critical components or messaging that came out of that, or concepts. And then that's where we get creative. We think of concepts. We think of, well, and honestly, it takes a lot of, I go to bed at night sometimes thinking about what I heard in the community. You kind of live in it for a while. You're just kind of just thinking about it for a long, long period of time, and then the ideas kind of formulate. But it's always in the collaborative team of the architecture, of the architects. Sometimes we just sit around and we're just talking about what makes sense, and somebody says, well, what about this? What about this? Well, what about that? And you know how it works. So that's why, again, collaboration is so important. And there's no one person that takes credit for any of this work. It's just impossible if you see somebody standing up thinking that they can, because it's just so broad and so many players that bring it to fruition.
So you spend a lot of time thinking about identity, culture, and public space, gathering space, how those things have been historically interlocked. What do you think the contemporary public space of 2050 looks like in the United States? Do you consider those questions?
Wow, that's a really good question. The contemporary public space in 2050, which is in 30 years, what does that look like?
30, 40, whatever.
Oh, okay, it's somewhere in the future. Hopefully I'm still around, or maybe not. So what does that look like? I can only describe what it looks like in terms of the experiences I hope people would have. I can't tell you, from what kind of, from the built expression, what it would look like, but I can tell you that this notion of creating shared experiences, this notion of creating opportunities where somebody that I normally would not cross paths with, that I can, and I feel like I'm in public, I'm in a space that we can share, in identity, and we can experience each other. And so that's kind of my vision. I think that's what a lot of these places start to do. In working in a lot of African American communities, the theme that we hear over and over again, it's almost, it's just ubiquitous, is feeling like feeling comfortable in my own skin, and I can walk in a place and feel comfortable. And that resonates with African Americans, because for years, they could, you could have maybe one African American walking down the street, but if you had three, it might be a little bit of a threat here, or certainly not something that's considered a gang. So people feeling like they can walk in public space and not be invisible, and actually be seen as a contributor. So that's what I envision, and I think a lot of these spaces help to promote that. We still have a long way to go, but at least they provide spaces for healthy conversation and communication, and the opportunity to encounter somebody that's totally unlike you. Yeah.
My name is Nitra. I'm an academic advisor for the School of Architecture, and I would like you to, can you tell us how you came to want to be an architect? I know for a lot of young Black children are not exposed to the field and have no idea that being an architect is even a possibility. And I think that if I had not been here, my daughter would have no idea. So were you encouraged in school? Did you grow up around architects?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a story I hate to tell, but it's a story I have to tell because it's the truth. You know, no, I keep in mind I'm a child of the '60s, and you know, growing up in the '70s, so there was my parents. No one could tell me what I wanted to be. Everybody could say, yeah, she likes to draw. Yeah, she likes to sketch. Yeah, they could say all of this. And then I was told, I think you want to be an engineer, because there were certain obvious things that people could relate to. But architecture, because nobody ever saw a black architect, or it just wasn't in the realm of possibility. And so, and this is the part I hate to tell, but it's the truth. I first heard the term architecture by watching a show on television, Architect. And you know, back then we were, you know, television was a luxury, so we only were allowed to watch like TV 2 nights a week. We had TV night. Yeah, I know people can't relate to that, but that's how it was. And so, you know, one of the shows that was on TV night, we would like get around, and there was an episode of the Brady Bunch. And I remember the episode so vividly. I remember, you know, like, what is he doing? Like, what is this guy, the father, as you guys know, was an architect, and, you know, it was this corny episode where he runs out with drawings and tries to save the building from, falling down. We know that's corny because architects don't physically save a building from falling down, but I heard the term, and then when I said to my parents, well, you know, what is that term? They were then able to say, oh, well, maybe. And then they were able to help me navigate and point me in the same direction. But it's still rigorous. You know, going to architecture school, there was like, 3 black people in the entire school, and not really knowing, how to put a portfolio together, just stumbling and bumbling my way all the way through, just trying to figure out that path. And so obviously that was decades ago. It's much better today, and I think there's so many, Chelsea's a good example. She left. Oh no, she's here. Of women who are in architecture school, and African American women, and that are, that I always say, yes, it's an investment. When I came out of architecture school, there were, people in my class my same year, not in architecture school, but in other areas of the school, that were making like a lot of money. I thought, oh my God, they're coming out making $25,000, and someone was making $40,000, and I'm like, and I got an offer here of $16,000 that I'm on my way, it's trying to, and you think, wow, but if you are doing something that you love to do, the investment pays off. Those people that are making, that were making $25,000 and $40,000 on their first offer, that didn't, many of them that didn't sustain, and they went on. But for architecture, it's such a rewarding profession. It really does sustain, and I'm really proud of you guys for, getting your master's, getting to it, and helping to contribute to a profession that's in dire need of young people, young talent, diversity, and really good architects.
All right.
Oh, you can
Maybe
toss
one
a
more
coin.
question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adam. I'm not a Georgia Tech student. My brother was a alumni as a Master's of Architecture student.
Okay.
And so my question, like you mentioned a text that you read when you were doing research, and watching my brother, y'all do a ton of research. And I was wondering which books you would recommend that have either changed your perspective or really influenced you as an architect.
There's a lot. It's funny. Some of the ones I told you, Dr. Fuller Love's book, obviously, was important to me. It depends on the time in my life. So as I hear the message in a lot of urban areas, like for instance of the impact of gentrification and young people, you guys coming out, not even being able to afford to live. If our cities become less multi-generational, multicultural, what do we have? We have cities with only people with over a certain income work, that doesn't make any sense. So that prompted me to read, Dr. Mindy Fuller-Love's book. From Good to Great is another book that I read. I mean, it all depends. There's just so many that in that particular moment they change my perspective on things. So I can't say that there's like one book that has completely caused me to do a 360, but I can tell you for each of those areas that I study, the books that are most important, like From Good to Great is wonderful, and Dr. Fuller-Love's book. There's a lot of books that I read on when I'm researching. I read a ton on the migration. I'm actually, fingers crossed, doing a lot of research on a potential project, meeting with a potential client tomorrow or Friday, on the West Coast, that I'm doing a ton of research. I'm just completely, I don't know, I kind of think like if I were an actor, it's like going in character. Like you're researching to play. It's like I'm in that mode right now. So I'm reading a lot, for this particular. So it's opportunistic, I should say, reading. I can't say I have a whole lot of time to do, a reading that's not really focused on the immediate thing in front of me. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys for your questions. And thank you to the members of GT Nomus and leadership out in the audience for helping to make this month successful. In closing, I'd like to remind you guys that tomorrow we will have an event hosted by Equity in Architecture. It'll be an awesome panel and discussion following. That starts at 6, I believe. Do we know the location? Here. Okay. So right here. It's going to be great. So please come out and support.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.